Hello. This is the first week in 22 of the total of our journey through Stuart Hall's book, Doctrine and Practice in the Early Church, with the accompanying 2 volumes, A New Eusebius and Creeds, Councils, and Controversies. You will have read, I hope, my introductory email about this, so you'll know a little bit of the background. We are going to proceed today, as we will each week, looking through first Hall's chapter and then some of the selections from one of the 2 collections of sources afterwards. There are now a lot of books of translated materials from the early church. From the early church there survives an ocean of material. No human being can live long enough to read it all. Setting aside the problems of languages and things, no human being knows all the languages necessary to read it all, and not all of it has been translated yet, though during the course of the 35 years or so that I've been doing this, this is my professional area, a vast amount of stuff has come into English, which was not available before. And new materials have even been discovered that were not known when I began this study. It's remarkable that new manuscripts, new material, and archaeological things, and art, etc., are still being discovered from the ancient world, both Christian and non-Christian. And so our knowledge expands all the time. This is the best time to study the early church, certainly since the fall of Rome in the West, for those of us who live in the West. We can know more about the early church now, in a lot of ways, than people who lived in the early church could have known, because they didn't have access to things across geographical spread the way we do now. Of course, they knew things that we can never know, about their liturgy and about the details of their daily practice, things like that. Our knowledge of early Christian worship is very deficient, because for centuries early Christian worship was not drawn from written materials, but rather was done extemporaneously. And then when liturgical materials began to be written down, they were written down in each individual place and then used until they were worn out, at which case they were copied over again in the current form of practice, which may not have been exactly what was written down anymore, the way we write in our liturgical books, so that we never actually do strictly what's printed in the book. And then the old books were destroyed, burned usually, because they were sacred, and so they didn't want to leave them lying around. They were either buried or burned, but usually burned. Okay. All of that aside, so the reason that these 3 volumes were chosen for us to use is that what is needed for a beginning study of the early church is something organized, focused, and clear. And Hall's book is all of these things. It is very easy to write a 1,000-page book on the early church. It's very difficult to write a 200-page book on the early church. Hall's book's about 240 pages, which is very brief for what he's trying to do. It's only about 10 pages a chapter. It's really a remarkable achievement. He was a long-time instructor in this area, which is a great help, because you learn what people know and what they need help with, and you learn how to organize your material by lecturing. Everyone gets, if you're paying attention, you get better the more you do this. So we're lucky to have Hall's book. Hall's book actually was written to go along with the previously existing New Eusebius and Creeds, Councils, and Controversies. The New Eusebius is from the early 70s, and it existed for a while before Creeds, Councils, and Controversies was produced. You can read those 2 as histories of the church. The way I first came into contact with them is by reading them myself as supplementary histories of the church. They're great, and they have been subsequently revised twice since the first time I read them. Um, their great advantage is that they deal not just with doctrine, not just with practice, not just with ancient daily life, but with all of those things, so that they help you see glimpses, at least, of a wide variety of different aspects of early Christian experience. And so for introductory books, they're very broad, which is useful. And they're also very useful things to have on your shelf, because you can look things up in them and review different things, and read little pieces of people's works, famous Christian writers, productions. And so there are things that will not be exhausted in their usefulness after you are done with your exams or after you have read them a number of times. I still go back and draw things from them. They're very good to photocopy from a piece or two and hand around at a Bible study or adult inquirers group or confirmation class. You will find these things very practical. And so there are a lot of different reasons why they were chosen by the group and approved by Father Smith and the bishops. And I'm very pleased that they did. I taught a class in the fall of 1992 using these materials, of course, earlier editions, right, at Catholic University, mostly for fourth-year seminarians, people who had already been ordained deacons in the Catholic Church, and for some beginning academic graduate students, people who were doing master's or doctoral work, a beginning survey for them. That year, interestingly enough, the majority of the class, as I recall, were Ukrainian deacons, some from the Ukraine, studying in the U.S., some from the U.S. The ones from the Ukraine, of course, could get married, and some of them were. The ones in the U.S. can't get married, exposing, I think, in some ways, the absurdity of present Roman Catholic practice in that regard. But anyway, it was a very intelligent class. I enjoyed it a great deal. I've done this before, but not since then. So I'm looking forward to this for a number of reasons. Let's begin. The first thing to know about the world in which the ancient church lived is that the huge majority of people in the world were what we would now call pagan. It's very important to understand that paganism is not a thing, in the same way that Hinduism is not a thing. Hinduism just means Indian, what Indian people do. And Hinduism is present-day native Indian paganism. Paganism is the traditional worship of the many gods of the Olympian pantheon and all of the different local things. But it's very important to understand that paganism was not an organized tradition. It was not the same in every place. If you were a worshiper of Zeus, you worshipped Zeus the way they worship Zeus in Dodona or in Olympia or in Athens or in Corinth, and there might well be similarities or continuities between one place and another, but there would also be things that were unique about the worship of Zeus in all of those different places. If you read Greek myth, you will see that there are a variety of myths covering the same thing, like the birth of Athena is not told in one particular way. There are a variety of different stories. There is no such thing as the pagan view of anything. Paganism was an organic thing that grew up over time in a variety of different places. There were civic cults that were based in particular cities, like there were, in Athens, they built the Parthenon for Athena, Parthenos, Athena, the maiden goddess. And that's a temple and a cult, a way of worshiping Athena, which was unique. Nobody else did it exactly the way they did it in Athens. Of course, in Athens, it's on the top of the Acropolis, and they took it very seriously, because she was their guardian goddess and the, in Christian terms, the patron saint of the city. But even if you knew everything about what they did in Athens, and we certainly don't, that doesn't mean you'd know everything there is about Athena, because other places where they worshipped Athena, they did it differently, and they had different ideas. There were civic cults. There were craft-related cults. Carpenters had gods. Silversmiths had gods. Farmers had gods. Women who made cloth had gods. Different crafts had different gods that they worshipped, and there were guilds. People who were potters would have a guild, say in Athens, and they would have gods that they worshipped as a group. And then there were also family gods. Every house had altars in it, and the head of the household, the pater familias, would worship those gods in the name of the family. Some of those gods, as far as we can tell, because of course people didn't write about it, right? As far as we can tell from archaeology and stuff, some of those gods were relatively standard. Some of them were less usual, and some of them, it seems, were unique, that there would be particular deities that a particular family would worship that nobody else we know of ever worshipped, right? Not only that, but there were gods that only men worshipped, goddesses that only women worshipped, goddesses for younger girls, goddesses for older women, gods for old men, gods for boys who were training to be warriors. All these different things were particular. No pagan person worshipped all of the gods. No pagan person had ever even heard of all of the gods, right? It's just not that kind of phenomenon. It's very important to understand that we say paganism as if it goes along with Judaism and Christianity, and those are apples and oranges. They do not fit together. You cannot contrast paganism usefully with Christianity. Okay, that's a very important thing to know. But it is also important to know that the ancient world was deeply religious, in the sense of people feeling bound. Religion from the word for binding, right? People feeling bound to do certain things. If you did not worship, if you were an Athenian and you didn't worship the civic gods of Athens the way you were supposed to, you were a traitor. I mean, that's what Socrates gets executed for. He gets executed for misleading the youth of the city, the younger men of nice families, not to worship the gods the way they're supposed to, and for also not worshiping the gods the way they're supposed to too. And when he argues, trying to defend himself, he argues that as a matter of fact he's very religious, he's doing what the gods want him to do, but he is essentially executed for religious crimes. This was something that the ancient world took very seriously. There on pages 2 and 3, these 6 different things, all of the different categories of that modern scholars look back on the ancient world and see. These are all very useful to understand. Now, as far as we know, essentially all ancient people, non-Jewish, pagan people, participated to some degree in the worship of the gods, whatever they thought of it. And it's important to understand that paganism didn't have theology the way Judaism and Christianity has theology. There were particular things you had to do, and if you did them properly, the gods were pleased. It didn't matter what you thought about it. You didn't have to have faith in Zeus. Zeus wanted you to offer him particular kinds of sacrifices at particular times, in particular places, and if you did that, nothing else mattered. As far as that goes, paganism functioned the way we think in our present culture of magic. If you did the right ceremony, the right spell, the right ceremony, you got the desired result. It didn't have anything to do with faith. That's important to understand. One of the things that makes possible is that you could be someone like Plato and have different ideas about what's really going on in the world and still participate in the daily worship of your city, which is Athens. Um, as soon as we can see what people think, as soon as there are writings that survive, which isn't as early as you would think, right around the year 500 is about when you begin to get the earlier surviving Greek prose writer is Herodotus, which is, late 400s, early 400s. As soon as we can see what people think, there are educated people who are suggesting that what's really going on is that there is a higher level of reality and that the gods that are worshipped, the particular gods and goddesses, are on a lower level. In other words, the philosophical people, as far as we can tell, always think that there is, in modern philosophical understanding, one sort of source of being, and then the gods and goddesses like Zeus and Hera are lower than that, later than that. As a matter of fact, Greek myth speaks that way. Zeus is the son of Kronos, time. Zeus is not the original being. Nobody thinks that. There are earlier gods and goddesses, and they fight and eat each other and kill each other and have sex with their brothers with sisters and produce these later Olympian beings. So that the myths of paganism themselves do not claim that the gods that people worshipped are equivalent to the God of the Bible. Right? The God of the Bible is in the beginning. God creates the heaven and the earth. That's not, you can't say Zeus instead of God and have a coherent idea. That's not what any pagan people thought about Zeus. It's important to understand that. So when Plato, for example, the beginning of a great philosophical tradition that continues to the present day, when Plato looks at reality, right, he thinks that the truest, highest, original kind of reality, level of reality, is a spiritual reality, and that all of the physical stuff comes later and is derived from the purely spiritual. Aristotle, when he thinks about where everything comes from, right, Aristotle, who is a student of Plato, Aristotle thinks that everything we see moves and interacts with everything else we see, cause and effect. If you throw a stone into the pond, you get ripples, and the ripples mean something, and you get different ripples depending on what kind of stone, all that sort of thing. If you blow on the water in a cup, you get ripples. Everything's caused by something else. But at the very beginning of this process, there is a being that acts to produce everything we see, but is itself the beginning of the chain. It is not acted on by anything else. It makes other things happen. Nothing makes it happen. So it moves stuff, but nothing moves it. It's the unmoved mover, or the unacted upon actor, right? That's his idea of the source of everything, the one divine, truly divine original being. And after that, of course, the Stoics, a little bit later, who begin with Zeno and are very influential later in the ancient period. The Stoics look at the world and they see order. So the question is, where does the order come from? I mean, our experience of order is that, if I go into my bedroom in the morning to get dressed after I've exercised and the bed is made, I assume that my wife has been there and made it. If I see order, I assume someone has ordered it. And if it isn't made, and if there's a note on it, make this bed, then I have to make it. And then if it's made, then she looks in there and assumes that I did it because, there's order, and so it's been ordered. That's a natural human way of looking at the world. You will notice that all of these ideas, the highest level of reality is spiritual. God is the source of everything we see, causes it to be, but nothing causes him. And God is the orderer of an organized creation, None of those ideas are hostile to Christianity. As a matter of fact, Christianity agrees with all of them, right? At the same time, we accept them all and think of them not as being at war with each other, but in some ways as kind of mutually supportive. They're all contained in our basic ideas about the nature and character of God. So, first thing you see is that there is present in the pagan culture ideas that very basic central ideas about reality and the nature of the world that the biblical teaching of the church and the church's expression of its own experience, of the gospel, is going to find very comfortable. It's not going to be comfortable with the pagan religious stuff. That's abomination for the biblically preaching church, right? But the philosophical stuff is very attractive. So one of the things we will see is that the church will make use of the way these Greek philosophers talk about their ideas as ways to introduce Christian ideas. I mean, if you have people in the culture, the Platonists, talking about spiritual reality, and you want to talk to people about how you think God is a spiritual reality and that's what's really going on, you'll use the term spiritual reality. You won't make up some other term that they won't understand, right? You'll make use of what they already have. And that this is the way in which the church piggybacks in important ways on classical culture, not deriving its teaching from the Greek philosophers, but making use of what Greek philosophers say in order to communicate what the church already has to say before it starts that interaction. Right? If you want to understand the early church, you have to know something about the way the culture in which it lived, operated, and thought, or you won't know what the church is talking about and why they're doing that. 2,000 years from now, if you live that long and you're teaching a class on C.S. Lewis, right, and you want to sort of explain mere Christianity or, miracles or something like that to a class, you will have to explain to them a little bit about the 20th century and the 21st century and the rise of secularization in Western culture and the beginning of the nuclear age and all this kind of stuff. All of these things are woven into the way C.S. Lewis writes because he's talking to people who think that way and think about those things. It's not that he gets his ideas that he's trying to communicate in mere Christianity from that stuff in his own culture, but he uses that stuff in his own culture to try to teach them mere Christianity, which is something that he gets from somewhere else, right? The church always operates that way if it's doing its job. But of course, we know our own culture, we don't know their culture, so we have to spend a certain amount of time and effort getting to know what they knew automatically in order to understand the conversation and the expression and the form of life and choices that the early church made in their attempts to be the body of Christ on earth and faithful disciples. Okay. The way the Roman Empire operated from the very beginning was that whenever possible, they made use of local political systems in order to control new areas that they moved into and conquered. That is to say, if they took over a new country or a new city, they liked to leave in place the ruling people that were there, leave alone their religion, leave alone their culture, leave alone their practices, and govern them as much as possible with local people. I mean, this is where the upset in the New Testament about Jews being tax collectors for the Romans come from, right? When the Jews take over Palestine, they don't move in 5,000 Italian bureaucrats and start, running everything. They try to hire local people. The people who are present in the New Testament are the standard people that would have been present everywhere in the Roman Empire. They are soldiers, which are necessary to protect the empire and also to keep down recalcitrant populations like the Jews. The legal system judges so that law can function and people can be punished for crimes, and decisions about the inheritance of property and stuff can be done. And tax collection. Those are the three basic things that the Roman government did: military, legal system, tax collection. That's what the Roman government cared about. They didn't have any, well, certainly they didn't have any welfare, but they didn't have any, Department of Agriculture where they sent people to Galilee to tell you how to do your grape arbor. They were only interested in the bare bones operating of their own governmental system, and everything else they left alone. So as a matter of fact, what you see in the New Testament is a very useful sort of local view of the way the Roman government actually operated. The army tended to be in difficult areas, and Israel's a difficult, Palestine was a difficult area because it was recently added and the Jews are always difficult. So there were soldiers around. And they would also be on the borders, along the Persian border in the east, because they were always fighting with the Persians, and along the Rhine in the northwest, because they were always fighting with the Germans, who were always trying to invade. Those were the main places that the Roman army functioned. Other than that, there would have been large whole, country-sized pieces of the empire where there were really very few soldiers and very few government people around. What's now Yugoslavia in the very early period of the church is a fruitful, prosperous, settled, calm part of the empire. People like St. Jerome come from there. There is a high level of education. Things are highly developed, and there aren't a lot of soldiers around because there's no fighting going on. Southern France, for example, from a very early period, or even Spain from a very early period, is settled and calm, and except for some legal people and tax people, sort of ungoverned. There aren't really, every governor has a few soldiers and stuff like that because there were no police, right? But it's a mistake if you think that every city in the Roman Empire had a barracks in it with soldiers. That's just not true. The Roman Empire was run by a tiny group of people, according to our expectations of how much government it takes to run an area. And the Roman army was actually, according to our understanding too, very small for the size of territory it was running. It's a sign, among other things, of the general, first of all, the general non-political nature of the population. Ancient people didn't expect to be involved in politics. It didn't occur to anybody, including them, that they should have any say in anything. And so they didn't complain when they didn't. And also that, generally speaking, the Roman Empire was a relatively good place to live compared to other places in the world at the time. It was more developed and safer, and there were more access to things like food and shelter that people wanted than there would have been without it. So it was a pretty good thing. What this means, of course, is that there is a system into which, a highly developed system into which the church is going to move and try to function. Religion was not something that the Roman Empire got involved in. There were temples to the genius of Rome, the sort of protective spirit that looked after Rome, in the major cities around the empire, and the city would pay for a priest to do sacrifices to the genius of Rome. And not everyone was required to go there and do that, but those things existed. If your city refused to do that, that was a way of rebelling against Rome. Special groups like the Jews, whom everybody knew wouldn't worship the genius of Rome because they had their own particular ancient and so therefore respectable ethnic religion, were not required to worship the genius of Rome. The high priest would say prayers for the emperor and the empire in the temple, and that was considered enough and appropriate for them to do. The kind of prayers that the church offers for civil authority all the time when it worships. Those things go back to the very beginning. As long as the church was considered to be part of Judaism, then saying that kind of prayer as a part of its worship was all that anybody expected. It's only after the Roman world begins to make a distinction between Christians and Jews and thinks that Christians are not a kind of Jew, but rather something else, that's when the Christians begin to get into trouble. We'll see that already in the selections that we're going to look at today. It happens quite soon. But it was not original, and it's difficult to tell how unavoidable it was. There are clear signs that for quite a while Christians did argue that they were the good Jews, and the non-Christian Jews were the bad Jews. You see a lot of that in the New Testament, right? It's a real theological break when Christians stop arguing that, and they begin arguing about Christianity as a separate thing from Judaism. But that actually in details is quite a difficult thing to trace. We're gonna, it'll keep coming back, but we can't do too much about it now. Okay, let's turn, we're about halfway done. Let's turn and look at the first 6 readings. Just to remind you, I have chosen to select them by their numbers rather than their page numbers. It's easier, and easier for me and easier for you, I think. And it's not the way that Hall refers to them in his book, as I noted in the syllabus, but it's the way that makes, I think, life easier when we're doing class. So that's the way we're going to do it. So I have not always chosen everything the way Hall does. What I've done is try to imagine what I'm going to say to you and then imagine what I want to use to say it to you. And that's my principle for doing things this way. Some of the selections we'll come back to more than once, and some of them I think we won't read together. I hope at some point you'll read these entire things from beginning to end, just because it's a very useful thing to do. And if you like this kind of thing, enjoyable. But we're trying to be practical and focused. So I'm looking for particular things. To begin with here, we get our first reading is from a Jewish author, Josephus, who writes very important, because useful for us, writings about Judaism in Greek for a non-Jewish audience. He's trying to explain Judaism to the educated pagan public, particularly in Rome. He's living in Rome while he's writing. Educated Romans spoke Greek the way educated Russians spoke French in the imperial period, or educated Englishmen spoke French for that matter. When Brutus stabs Julius Caesar to kill him, we think he says et tu Brute, right? You too, Brutus. What he actually said is kai su teknon, you too, child, which is Greek, right? They were speaking Greek to each other because they were well-educated upper class Romans. Just FYI. Anyway, I've always thought that the language you speak, as when you're stabbed, whatever it was, 37 times or whatever it was, when you're bleeding to death on the floor, that's probably the language you think in. So Caesar, who was a great and famous Latin author, seems to have been very Greek in his personal conduct, I guess you'd say. Anyway, okay. The martyrdom of James, the Lord's brother, about 62 A.D. That's, of course, that's Stevenson trying to come up with a date. They don't have dates like that, but I'm assuming you know that kind of thing. Okay, what's happening here? Ananus, who is the high priest and a member of the Sadducees, of course, because they're running the temple, and is very eager to go after people who aren't the kind of Jews he thinks they ought to be. When Festus, the previous Roman governor, is dead, and Albinus is on his way to get there but not present yet. In other words, when there is no Roman official there in charge, he assembles the Sanhedrin, arrests the brother of Jesus called James, right? There's that list of brothers of Jesus in one of the Gospels. I can never remember which. I think it may be Matthew. But anyway, James, the brother of the Lord, who was famous, as a matter of fact, as a follower of the law, but apparently not the way that Ananus thought he ought to be, and accuses him as a breaker of the law, hands him over to be stoned, and they stone him to death before the Roman authorities get there. Right? This is a religious accusation, and he's given a religious kind of execution, and it's clearly inappropriate. The local king, Agrippa, doesn't like this, and the Romans, of course, don't like this. Remember that this is not the kind of thing the Romans want the Jews to do. They know the Jews love to kill each other and fight with each other. This is why the Sanhedrin, when they're trying to get Jesus executed, take him to Pilate. And Pilate says, "What are you bringing him to me for?" And they say, "Because we're not allowed to execute him. And we want you to execute him for us." Right? This is what Ananus does to James when when the sheriff's out of town. What does this teach us? Well, of course, there are no details about what James did that Ananus thinks is inappropriate, right? But we know, for example, from Acts that Peter and John and James, those people, and other James, right, son of Zebedee, those people are meeting together for prayers and the breaking of bread, but also still going to the temple. We have every reason to think that James is still going to the temple. It must be the stuff he does in addition to that Ananus doesn't like. Clearly, James is noticeable enough so Ananus sees him and doesn't like what he's doing and takes advantage of the opportunity to grab him and kill him when the authorities are gone. It tells us that the church is known and noticeable. It makes sense for us to think that James is killed as an example to other people who either might join the church or are members of the church, that they are doing something inappropriate, and that's why he's gone after. But more details than that, this reading does not provide. It's something. It's definitely something. We know that about one generation, Jesus dies in about the year that we call 30. So about one generation after the death of Jesus, his brother is in Jerusalem, a prominent religious figure, prominent enough so that the temple authorities want to kill him. And that tells us that the church continues and is noticeable, which is more than nothing. Okay, now the next one here, expulsion of the Jews from Rome. Suetonius, an upper-class educated Roman who writes lives of the first 10 Caesars, right, including Julius, in his Life of Claudius, who is the emperor in 49, says, since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he, Claudius, expelled them from Rome. This is the expulsion, apparently, that sends Priscilla and Aquila to the east, where they meet up with Paul. Chrestus is usually considered to be a corruption or a misspelling of Christus, Christ. It's possible that Chrestus could be a name, but because it's among the Jews and because it seems to be the source of tension between different groups of Jews, because of Chrestus, essentially all modern scholars, myself included, think that this has to do with the growth of the Christian element in the Jewish population in Rome. The fact that because of the way it's written, because of the way Suetonius writes at the instigation of Chrestus, it seems pretty clear that he knows that the trouble is among the Jews. He knows that it has to do with Chrestus or Christus. He thinks it's a name, right, not a title. He treats it as a name. He also seems to think, at the instigation of Chrestus, that Chrestus is alive is present. The most obvious thing to expect is that he thinks Chrestus is in Rome stirring people up. But Chrestus also might be imagined to be outside of Rome, but sending people into Rome and stirring things up. But it's very interesting. He doesn't really know anything about Jesus. For example, he doesn't know Jesus. There's no sign that he knows Jesus' name, right? But he does know that there's a connection between Chrestus and the Jews. And it's interesting, of course, because it tells us that by 49, the church had spread. This is before Paul gets to Rome. The church had already spread to Rome. This is something, as I said, that we know echoes of from Acts and the letters of Paul, because Priscilla and Aquila, coming from Rome, go to the east, apparently because of this scattering of the Jewish community, which we know was quite large in Rome, though we don't know numbers. Okay, about 15 years after that, Nero. This is the story that lies behind the burning of Rome, where Nero fiddles, really plays on the harp, while in other words, Nero doesn't do anything about the fire and lets Rome burn, and then built a big palace in the result. What's interesting about this, Tacitus is another high-level Roman writer. Tacitus actually was a senator, politically well-connected, well-educated man. He's writing his annals of Rome, of which very little survive, but what does survive is very important. What's interesting about this is, well, first of all, Tacitus doesn't care about the Christians, right? Tacitus is interested in Nero. The point of the story, from Tacitus's point, is that Nero is rotten, and Nero takes advantage of the Christians to blame on them something that was not their fault, in order to try to excuse himself in front of the eyes of the population. He's no admirer of the Christians, right? If you look about 5 lines down on page 2 in this bottom selection, the Christians, from whom the name had its Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a deadly superstition again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but also in the city of Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world meet and become popular. He knows that he knows where Christ was, right? And he knows a place and a time under Pontius Pilate that he's executed by the Roman government. He knows that much. He thinks the church is creepy and Christians are bad, and it's bad that they're in Rome, but he seems to know where they come from. He also, even though he doesn't like them, he doesn't think that they're responsible for this particular, he doesn't think that they set Rome on fire, right, which is what they're accused of. So it's interesting that this upper class Roman person who's in Rome, writing about Rome, knows where and when Jesus was executed, because it's 35 years before, a long way away. It's not, he would have had to ask around in order to know that. So excuse me, the non-Christian, non-Jewish world is learning more about Christianity, even when they don't like it, and even when they're not connected with it, they're not exposed to it. There's no reason to think that Tacitus was talking to Christians about this. He certainly could have, but he gives no sign of it. Okay, Suetonius, whom we saw in the first one, in his Life of Nero, mentions in passing here at the top of page 4, punishment was inflicted on the Christians, a class of men given to a new and wicked superstition. He doesn't like it either, right? He knows that Christianity is new, which is interesting. New in the ancient world is bad. Old is good. That's why Judaism is respectable for Jews, because it's very ancient. Ancient things are respectable. New things are not, and the Christians are bad because the Christians are, let's what's wrong with the Christians here? Just to begin with. Well, let's leave that for a second. These are all sources from Rome here in number 3. The last one is a very early Christian writing, what's called the First Epistle of Clement, from Rome, the church in Rome, to the church in Corinth. People date it at different times. It's not absolutely certain when it's dated. Late in the 1st century, maybe. Anyway, this is a Christian in Rome writing to Corinth. And so what we're interested about here is what he says about what he knows about the earlier history of the church in Rome. So look see on the left-hand side of this writing in the middle of page 4, let us set before our eyes the good apostles, Peter, who through unrighteous jealousy endured not 1 or 2 but many labors, and so having borne witness proceeded to his due place of glory. So he knows that Peter suffered and is now dead, right? Through jealousy and strife, Paul displayed the prize of endurance, 7 times in bond, driven into exile, stoned, appearing as a herald in both East and West, won noble fame for his faith. He taught righteousness to the whole world. After reaching the limits of the West, bore witness before the rulers. Then he passed from the world and went to the holy place, having shown himself the greatest pattern of endurance. One thing to notice is that neither of these descriptions require us to believe that Clement thinks these people were martyred. That it doesn't say that specifically. They go to glory and stuff, but you can go to glory without being martyred, right, if you're a saint. Clement does seem to think that Paul had traveled to the limits of the West, which would have been Spain. You may know, if you've read F.F. Bruce's book, Paul, Apostle of the Heart Set Free, that he suggests that Paul does go to Spain. It's certainly possible that Paul went to Spain. People did go to Spain, right? It would be interesting to know that. Whether he thinks this because of the mention in the letter to the Romans, which the church in Rome would certainly have a copy of, right? In the letter to the Romans, Paul mentions that he intends to go to Spain. So whether Clement is just getting that from the letter, or whether Paul went to Spain and came back and told them in Rome about that, we don't know, because Clement doesn't tell us. There is knowledge of both Paul and Peter in Rome. They think of them as our apostles, so they're connected with the city in the mind of the church in the city. But there are a lot of things that we automatically think about the church in Rome that Clement doesn't say. Now, when you turn to the next page, page 5 here, this selection from Eusebius, this does say a whole lot more of the things that we associate with Peter and Paul in Rome. But Eusebius is living in Palestine, and he's 200 years or so after Clement. So is he reciting later, excuse me, I've been like this for 3.5 weeks. Is he reciting later tradition? Or does he have access to more information that Clement doesn't have access to? We don't know. What is he saying? It is related that in his day, Paul was beheaded at Rome itself. That's in the day of Nero. And that Peter likewise was crucified. This story is accredited by the attachment which prevails to this day of the names of Peter and Paul to cemeteries there. Also by a churchman named Gaius, who lived in the time of Zephyrinus, bishop of the Romans, which is about the 120s or 30s, I think, is Zephyrinus. But that's just off the top of my head. I might be wrong. Anyway, the dates of all these people are extremely doubtful. Anyway, this is very interesting. Peter is associated with the cemetery, which is now under St. Peter's Church in the Vatican, right? As a matter of fact, under the main altar is the tomb that is thought to have been Peter's, or is thought to have been Peter's by very early Christians. So that's one cemetery, because the cemetery is all around him. New archaeology has been done in the last 20 years, which is very interesting in this regard. Paul is associated with a different cemetery outside the walls of Rome on the way to Ostia, the port of Rome. The church is called, appropriately, St. Paul's outside the walls. And so those assignments go back at least before the time that Eusebius writes. So that's really quite early, because he writes in about he writes the history in about 300, something like that, 310, and then he's adding on to it later. Anyway, one of the things I'm trying to show you by looking at this is that what we think we know about the very early church is collected together from different sources. Also, that not all of the sources that we use speak about these things the way we would expect them to speak. For example, this first epistle of Clement that is very upfront and certain about claiming connection between the Church of Rome and Peter and Paul, and talks about them going to glory and stuff, knows them as being dead, but does not speak of them clearly as being martyred. This later one does speak of them and even mentions the particular ways in which they were executed. Eusebius does. But of course, that's later. That's after several great persecutions. The church's interest in martyrdom is different by the early 300s than it is by the late, in the 90s of the first century. It may be as simple as that. We don't know. But it's important to understand that, well, when people ask me after church, down when we're getting coffee, Father Russell, do we know that Peter and Paul died in Rome? I say there are very ancient, very clear traditions that they did, and as a matter of fact, there's archaeological reasons for thinking that this is correct. You'll notice that that's accurate, but I didn't say yes. We don't know that. Very few things do we know about stuff that long ago. If you ask me, do I think that they did, then yes, I think they did, and there's good reason to think they did, but that's a very different thing. This is a useful set of sources to have if you're thinking about that stuff, and if you want to remind yourself about what we actually know and what we don't know. For example, number 4 here on page 6, the flight of Christians from Jerusalem, about 66 AD. 70 AD is the revolt of the Jews against the Romans that ends with the destruction of Jerusalem, the wiping out of the temple, the end of fully functioning Judaism as we know it, the scattering of the Jews, right? Eusebius here in the 3rd book makes pretty clear that as far as he's aware, the Christian community in Jerusalem, realizing that bad times were coming, upped and moved from Jerusalem across the Jordan River into what we would now call Jordan, to Pella, which is still there, and that it stayed there for a considerable amount of time. We lose track of it after a while because of more unrest and violence. But this does show us still that even after the death of James, the church continued to be present and function in Jerusalem, and that it was only the destruction of Jerusalem and its replacement with a pagan city, Aelia Capitolina, when the Romans built a temple to the genius of Rome on the place where the temple to the Lord had been, as a way of trying to prevent the Jews from doing what they'd done before, having a focal point for their, national life, which was something that the Romans wanted to discourage. Anyway, we have two more selections. So we know it extends our knowledge of the life of the church in Jerusalem to the point at which everybody's life in Jerusalem is really coming to an end, because it's really over with by the time 70 AD comes around. Things have really changed, and they don't go back to the way they were, and that's worth knowing. Now, number 5 is interesting. And the Emperor Domitian, Flavius Clemens, who was a very socially and politically important man, had been a consul, was a cousin to the emperor, and his wife, Flavia Domitilla, because this is the Flavian dynasty, right? Flavia Domitilla, she's related to them too. They were charged by Domitian with atheism, and on this many others who made shipwreck on Jewish customs were condemned on the charge of atheism, of whom some were put to death. Domitilla, because she was a woman, was sent into exile, but Flavius was executed. This shows interest in Judaism, or perhaps Christianity, hard to tell, among upper-class Romans. It shows that because if you get really interested in Judaism or Christianity, it's going to draw you away from the worship of pagan gods, because you're going to be taught and being convinced that there's only one God, and it's the God of the Bible, right? So that's why they would be charged with atheism, because they're not worshiping the gods anymore. And the Clement who wrote the Epistle of Clement, which is our last selection here, number 6, it's possible that Clement was Flavius Clemens. It's more likely that he was someone in his household, a freedman, perhaps someone who had been a slave of Flavius Clemens, and then is freed, and then would take the name Clemens as his second name, so that there would be dozens and dozens and dozens of people in Rome who were called Clement, and the members of the family would be a very small group, and the members of, descendants of people who had been slaves and then freedmen of the family would be very much more numerous. It's much more likely that the first epistle of Clement is written by one of those freedmen or a descendant. It is interesting, of course, that the couple themselves get into serious trouble for being interested in, for being atheists and interested in Jewish practices. One of the things that indicates is it would have been probably a pretty safe place to be a slave or freedman who was interested in Christianity or Judaism, if the master and mistress are too, because they're not going to go after you, because, of all the things, if Flavius, the head of the family, is really interested in Judaism or Christianity, he's not going to be doing all the pagan practices that would lead him to be mad if you're not doing the pagan practices, because they want everyone in the household to do the same thing. So that we begin to see that the church, or things connected to the church, are reaching up the social scale. And this is still before the year 100. And this, remember, is in Rome, a long way from Palestine. So the church is spreading in a lot of interesting ways, even if Flavius and his wife are not Christians. And it's certainly possible that they were. And that Dio Cassius, who writes this, thinks that it's just Jewish stuff, right? Because as a Roman pagan, he can't tell the difference between Jews and Christians, and he doesn't much care. It's weird and it's bad, and they shouldn't have done it, and they're atheists, and they should have been executed, right? No matter how that works. Okay. Um, just a quick note on the sixth one. What's really important for our point of view about selection 6, this little part of the first epistle of Clement from Rome to Corinth, is that we've seen enough to know that the church in Rome was having a hard time. People were getting executed, they were getting driven out of the city, they were under pressure, they were being accused of atheism. It was not always easy to be a Christian in Rome. But at the same time that this is going on, because the first letter of Clement is pretty close in time to the arrest of Flavius Clemens, at the same time, they are writing a letter to the church in Corinth to try to encourage the Christians in Corinth and try to exhort them to be good Christians and, hold to it even in hard times. In other words, even when things are tough in Rome or in a particular place, even when things are locally tough, the people who belong to the church think of themselves not just as a small group that's under pressure, but as part of a larger whole. And they think of the Christians in Corinth, who were also having difficulty, as part of the same whole. They write to each other from one place to another, the way Paul and James and Peter and John did in the New Testament. That writing back and forth from one congregation to another, because we're all in this together, is something that Christians feel moved to do even at the most difficult times in their lives, religiously and otherwise. Because if you're, getting arrested and executed, you've got religious problems, but you've also got other problems too. That's very important to know. The sense of the church as a universal thing that everybody belongs to, not just your little group in Rome, but the other groups in other cities, seems to be very strong and original, present from the beginning. Clement doesn't explain that to the Corinthians, but the whole fact that he is writing on behalf of the church in Rome requires that to be true. And that's very important to see. Okay, so we end there. Next week we will come back and talk about community and morality, more about sort of what's going on inside the church, right? Instead of how the church is bumping up around with things around it. But I hope that you've found this interesting. We will keep on going, and I look forward to seeing new things with you and hearing from you if you're writing papers. Thank you.